Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and tonight is truly a very special evening. I think you're going to enjoy our program. This event is part of C by C Amplified, an ideas festival put on by World Affairs councils from across the country. It's an opportunity for councils to present the important work that they do. So when my friend, Ambassador Mark Grossman, contacted me, I guess it was about 3 or 4 months ago, and he said, would Dallas like to be part of this town meeting? Of course, I leapt at the opportunity, but none of us had any idea that what the world would be like today. But nevertheless, the need is even greater for those of us who are concerned about the direction and capacity of the U.S. Foreign Service. Rather than take time with lengthy introductions, because if I did that, you would never hear from the ambassadors. I'm just going to hit a few highlights very quickly. So Ambassador Mark Grossman, I said he was my friend, and indeed I hope I am, because I'm the one who got him to become chairman of the World Affairs Councils of America a number of years ago. In fact, he served in that capacity for 2 years until President Barack Obama grabbed him and made him the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. During his career, he was ambassador to Turkey. He was also Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and today he is vice chairman of the Cohen Group. Ambassador Nancy McEldowney, she's a distinguished professor and director of the Master of Science in Foreign Service program at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Of particular interest, she was director of the Foreign Service Institute and the National Foreign Affairs Training Center from 2013 to 2017. She was ambassador to Bulgaria too during her career. Ambassador Marcy Reese. She's a senior fellow with the Future of Diplomacy Project at Harvard and senior advisor at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute. She too was U.S. ambassador to Bulgaria. And I think it's very interesting that she had the experience as serving as director of the State Department's Office of United Nations Political Affairs. Ambassador Nick Burns. He's a professor of the practice of diplomacy and international relations at Harvard Kennedy School. He served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008, ambassador to NATO, ambassador to Greece, and while at the State Department, he served also as department spokesman, and he was at the White House from 2014 to 2017 when he was with the National Security Council. So, Ambassador Grossman, take it away.
Jim, thank you very, very much, and welcome to all of you. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to be here, as all of us do. If I could just pick up on one of the points that Jim Falk talked about, which is this great institution that we have in the United States of America, the World Affairs Councils, all across the country. As Jim said, I had the good fortune to be the president of the National World Affairs Councils of America for a couple of years, and it got me to be introduced to so many people and so many institutions all around the country. And we thank you for your interest in international affairs. It's enormously important. The work you do with students, the work you do with communities, all of these things are important. And so as Jim said, we hope if you're not a member, you'll become one. If you are a member, you'll be very active. And as Jim said, that was a time that we had a chance to meet, and he's been a great friend since. I've had the opportunity on a number of occasions to be at World Affairs Council Dallas-Fort Worth, and I count myself as one of those people who'll do anything for Jim Falk, except for one thing, and that is he has never convinced me to ride my bicycle in August in Texas in an event called the Hotter Than Hell Century. And Jim, I love you very much, but I'm never going to do that, not anytime with you. So I also wanted to thank the organizers of this event, and I think it's fantastic that the National World Affairs Council organization has chosen this program to be part of their feature week. We were so excited to hear this. We were delighted to do Dallas-Fort Worth, but the fact that there's a larger audience now is enormously exciting. And finally, I just wanted to thank all of you. We're honored that you're interested in what we're trying to do. And I hope this evening will be a little bit different, as Jim said, which is to say that I'll make some introductory remarks, and maybe my colleagues will have a few things to say as well. But then we're interested in what you have to say. We're interested in your guidance. We're interested in your advice. So please do take up the invitation that Jim has given you to give us questions, to give us advice, because we're looking for people to help us try to accomplish this task. I'd spend a couple of minutes on the history of this so you can recognize kind of how it came to be. We first started talking about this a couple of years ago, and we said to ourselves, there needs to be a strategic look at the Foreign Service, a strategic look at the State Department. And we went looking for a home. And happily, Ambassador Burns, Professor Burns, found a home for this project at Harvard University. We had a plan. We had a plan about how we were going to spend 2019, and of course then 2020, and then COVID-19 comes along, and just like you, every single person on this broadcast, we adjusted. We've had 4 workshops so far. We've got another one tomorrow. This is the first time we've gone outside of Washington, D.C., so we're very excited about that. We started this idea with the thing that motivated us in our careers, which is this belief that diplomacy is America's first line of defense in a complex and dangerous world. And you all know, because you follow this so closely, that American diplomats are today working for the American people in over 280 U.S. embassies and consulates around the world and at the State Department in Washington. And as we've tried to think about what's unique about the Foreign Service, what is it that makes it special? We've come to believe that the idea is that FSOs, these Foreign Service officers, can apply their unmatched regional expertise and substantive experience to the protection of American citizens, the promotion of our national interests around the globe. And I know that there are many business people in this audience, so I want to say that that's very much includes supporting U.S. businesses, U.S. exports, and U.S. investments. We also believe that American diplomacy and the U.S. Foreign Service are facing some pretty profound challenges. The Foreign Service officers who represent our country around the world today are working in a State Department that, in our view, is under-resourced, it's understaffed, and struggles with outdated legacy structures and technologies. And that matters because American diplomacy matters, especially at a time when United States economic, political, and military strength is being challenged around the world. That's by China, that's by Russia. And again, you all follow this, so you know what a challenging time it is out there in the world today. We also start with the presumption that the Foreign Service has been weakened by what can only be called a politicization of American diplomacy during recent administrations. And I want to be clear here. This is not a question that is just to the Trump administration. This is now several administrations back. The United States now has the highest percentage of political appointee ambassadors over 60 years. And in recent Democratic and Republican administrations, an increasingly large number of senior people at the State Department, assistant secretaries, have become political appointees rather than career people. One other thing I want to be clear with, and we've been very clear to ourselves about this, is we know that many things about the Foreign Service itself must change. This project will not succeed unless there is some serious self-examination and advice from groups like this. So this is not about, oh, the Foreign Service is a victim. This is about self-examination and recognizing that change has to come as well. And I talked a little bit about legacy structures and legacy technology. So I guess in today's language, the State Department and the Foreign Service has got a legacy culture, and change in culture is key. If you think about how this happened, it happened really starting in 9/11, when the focus of American foreign policy and national security resources on the war on terrorism tilted our national priorities and budgetary resources towards military and intelligence agencies. And we must have, and we have, a defense capability second to none. And of course, every single person who's ever served as a diplomat knows that diplomacy must be backed by force. But we take as a given what General Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, has said, which is that you need a combination, and you need military might and diplomatic strength. And so we've launched this nonpartisan study to try to spark a national debate on what's needed to make American diplomacy, and specifically the State Department, the Foreign Service, the Civil Service, as strong as possible to defend American values and interests in the decades ahead. And the goal is to recommend specific, practical, and achievable ways to ensure American diplomats have the capabilities and the skills and the resources that they need to overcome any challenge to America. Again, those of you who follow this know that there have been three major efforts to modernize the Foreign Service. One in 1924 after World War I, one after World War II, and a third in 1980 when the Foreign Service Act was written now 40 years ago. At that time, the United States and diplomacy was emerging from the terrors of the Vietnam War and coping with the challenge posed by the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. But you've got an environment today that's shaped by new challenges, the rise of China, well, still Russia, and many of the other issues that are challenging us all around the world. You've got instability in the Middle East, threats from terrorist extremists, inequalities of income, cyber threats, climate, just to name a few. And of course, we're living through one of them today, which is the pandemic. So it's important to think strategically about the State Department and the Foreign Service. So to conclude, let me emphasize, first, nonpartisan, nonpartisan. As one of our participants in a workshop said, this is about the Foreign Service, not about our foreign policy. Secondly, inclusive. And we've tried very hard to keep an open mind about what it is that we're going to try to recommend. So that means making connections on Capitol Hill. It means talking to people outside of Washington, D.C. It means talking to the critics of the Foreign Service. It means making sure that we're talking to younger officers, those people still in the Foreign Service, and also those people, for whatever reason, who made a choice to leave after 5 or 10 or 15 years. We want to hear from families, since that's an important part of the Foreign Service community, and as many constituencies as we can. So the questions that we've focused on so far are, what kind of foreign service, what kind of diplomacy does America need to promote and protect our great country? And how do you get it? Which leads to the questions about what's the mission and the purpose of the State Department and the Foreign Service. We've been advised on a number of occasions, be big, be bold, and we'd like to do that, but we want to be practical and doable at the same time. Do you seek new legislation? Do you go back to the Congress? And finally, how is it that we take the idea that the Foreign Service, I think, desperately needs to be more professional or professionalized, the way our military is? And that's about looking at the challenges of diversity in the Foreign Service. It's looking at the challenges of professional education. It's helping people understand what their lives and their professions are going to be like for them and their families over their time of service. And so we look forward to your views. I know there won't be time for every question. And so if there are not, or if you have comments after, we hope that you'll be in touch with us. We promise that all of the views that you have to share will be very important to us. So Jim, I thank you for the opportunity to make that introduction. I'd see whether my colleagues have anything else to say, but I'll say we very much look forward to hearing from the audience this evening.
Ambassador Grossman, I'm going to call you Mark tonight, as I always do. There are a number of questions. Ryan Dukeman and a few, Alan, are asking about the role of the Foreign Commercial Service. Move to the Commerce Department, should it be brought back into state? Alan says, how should the U.S. Foreign Service weigh competing interests of American businesses and those of the American population? So let's start with those.
Well, thank you very much. And perhaps my colleagues would allow me to just make a couple of comments, and then I'd turn to all of them because they were, of course, involved in representing the United States and American business abroad. First of all, if you go back to the history, and I know this was controversial, and I think it was a shame, really, that the Foreign Commercial Service left the State Department in the first place. And the reason it did was because at the time, the State Department wasn't paying nearly enough attention to commercial questions and to the idea of American business. I think that's all changed. Part of the reason is that the Foreign Commercial Service has been successful. Foreign Commercial Service has recruited terrific people. They're very focused on their mission, and that is to try to help American businesses abroad. I don't really know if I have a view about whether it should be brought back into the State Department. What I have a view on, though, is that however this is structured, there needs to be an intense focus of everybody overseas in an entire mission on helping American companies sell their products, helping American companies do their business, make sure that they're protected, make sure that there's a level playing field out there. And I think one of the good things that's happened at the State Department over the last few years has been the increased attention on commercial work. There are now awards given for people who do this extremely well. Ambassadors understand that if they can get a big project from an American company, it's a galvanizing effort across the entire mission.
I see Nancy nodding her head. Let's see what she has to say.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Nancy.
thanks very much for that, Jim. I couldn't agree with Mark more. When I was an ambassador overseas, every single day I got up and my job was trying to serve American business interests in the country that I was serving, but also trying to promote investment. And we all know now how critical that is. 1 in 5 American jobs are supported by international trade. Almost 39 million American jobs. 12 million alone are supported by trade between Canada and Mexico. And one of the things that all of us want to do through this project is make sure that American diplomacy serves American interests. And I don't mean abstract concepts. I mean that it serves American citizens, people in Texas and Wisconsin and Michigan, where my family is all located, and every day that they can see the tangible benefits of that. So maybe that means bringing the Foreign Commercial Service back in, but in any case, it means setting our diplomats up so that they have the expertise, the knowledge, and the authority to go out and really deliver for American business and help create American jobs.
It will not surprise you that we have many questions about the International Visitor Program because so many World Affairs Councils are part of that. And there's always been this situation where USIA or USIS was in the Department of State and it wasn't. Talk about, one of you, about what you think about the appropriate role of public diplomacy should be and how do we get it on a stronger footing?
Marcy, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, sure. Well, first about the American Visitor Program, I think that that is one of the greatest assets that we have. Americans really sell their country themselves. I've found when I send people back to the United States, whether it's about the arts or it's about politics or it's about business, the people come back with a totally changed view of our country and they hold on to that. And then when we look at who are in important positions today in so many countries, so many of those people are people who are on the American Visitors Program when they were younger. And their affection and warmth for our country and our culture and our history remains. So it really is an incredible asset. As far as public diplomacy is concerned, I think that that is one of the categories of things that we really need to look at, because public diplomacy in the information age, especially with social media, has changed so much. And being a master of that technology is really an important part of the toolkit for our diplomats today. Also, we have to deal, let's face it, with a lot of negative information. And we have to think about really smart ways to do that. So I think that looking at how we conduct public diplomacy and ways to strengthen the program has to be a big part of what we're doing.
We have a number of questions from high school students as well as some young adults about the hiring process. And let me read you this comment from Kathleen Rojas. I would suggest for the hiring process to be more effective and efficient. My passion has always been diplomacy and my dream was to work at the State Department. The hiring should be focused on candidates that believe in the mission and love their country, not people who answer questions about old scenarios eloquently. I haven't been able to move past the slow application processes. So I read Kathleen's entire comment, but there are many here talking about diversity, how you reach out, and the fact that it does take so long to be go through the process, and then you still have no assurance of a position?
Yeah, Nick, you want to take that to start?
I'd be happy to. And Jim, thanks so much for putting our group, this group together. We're delighted to be with you. All of us, Nancy and Marcy and Mark and I, you can tell we're of a certain age. We came into the Foreign Service decades ago. It was a very different Foreign Service. And frankly, one of the weaknesses of the Foreign Service of the 70s and 80s and into the 90s was it was not diverse. It didn't look like America. It didn't represent all 50 states. And you won't be surprised that when we had a female Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, and then two African-American Secretaries of State, Colin Powell and Condi Rice, we made diversity a priority. And the State Department has tried very hard. We've succeeded, I think. Nancy and Marcy can tell you better than I can. We certainly have many more women in the Foreign Service and in leadership roles than we did when we first came in. We have fallen back, however, on diversity of African Americans. Right now, of our, more than 180 American ambassadors around the world, we have exactly 3 African American ambassadors, none of them African American women. And so that's a disgrace to the United States. And we also do not have anywhere close to the number of Latino Americans in the Foreign Service or at the ambassadorial level that we should. So this is a big struggle. Mark talked about the workshops we've been holding. We've had 4 of them. We have a 5th tomorrow. We have this great public event with you in Dallas-Fort Worth. We've heard a lot of complaints from currently serving officers as well as former officers about the lack of diversity. So I think I can say, I think the Obama administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration made this a major priority. We've seen it now tail off, and that no matter what happens in November, whether President Trump gets a second term, whether Vice President Biden wins, I hope that the future leadership of the State Department and the White House especially are going to make diversity important. I just say one more thing. I agree with the questioner. We need to look like America. We need to make it easier for people to join. I do think we should have very high standards. It's important to know history. It's important to be economically literate. It does help if you have some foreign languages, although if you don't, we train you in foreign languages in the State Department. But we need the very best minds, people who can actually run war and peace negotiations for the United States. We can do that, and we just got to work hard at the diversity end, and work hard at recruiting people out of college and graduate school. Nancy and I both work full-time for universities, and we're training the next generation. There are kids out there, young people out there who do want to be in the Foreign Service.
Mark, you may have touched a nerve here with something you said. I hear from Gabby Musarino. She is going to be a future FSO 2022, and she'll be attending the Fletcher School. But she says, what did you mean when you said professionalize the Foreign Service? And what can she do as an incoming officer to make an impact?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question. And Gabby, we'll look forward to welcoming you into the Foreign Service, and good for you. What I mean by professionalization is that at the moment, you have several challenges with the Foreign Service. People come into the Foreign Service, and over the period of their careers, maybe they get training, or as Colin Powell used to say, don't call it training anymore, call it professional education. And over a period of 20 or 25 years, a Foreign Service officer is lucky if she or he gets a week here, 2 weeks there, a little language training. Maybe they're lucky, they go to Harvard University for a few months for an economic brush up. But if you look at the difference between the professional education that our military colleagues get, it's an enormous difference. I had the good fortune to be the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs when Colin Powell was Secretary of State. And we used to do this routine in public. And he'd say, Mark, you're a senior Foreign Service officer. How much professional education did you have in your career? And I would say, oh, Mr. Secretary, language training aside, a few weeks before I went to DCM, a few weeks before I went to be an ambassador. And he would say he had 6 years of professional education during his 30-year career as a military officer. Now, I don't say that Foreign Service people need 6 years. That's probably impossible. But somewhere beyond 4 weeks certainly is required. If you think about all of the challenges that are out there today, We need people who have, who keep lifelong learning. That's what makes people resilient. It makes people ready to take on the next challenge. So that is the very first thing about professionalization. Secondly, we've heard a lot in these workshops that we've had now about the need to do better in terms of strategic planning at the State Department. And we don't really value that, and we ought to. That'd be another area of professionalization. And just to emphasize the point that Nick made in the previous questioner, I think a commitment to diversity is also part of professionalization. So we'd like to make some recommendations so that Foreign Service people today, and like you, Foreign Service people who are coming in, can look over their career and say, this is an institution that's going to help me grow, and it's an institution that is going to help me be smarter, more educated, and more ready to do the jobs as they come along.
Let me ask you to be a little bit more specific, Mark, about the training, because you talk to military officers, as you suggested, and they really do, as they advance, have a year or two of training. Why is it so difficult for Foreign Service officers to get the training? Is it time? Is it financial resources? Because what I've read is that often that really works against you if you've taken time off to go learn a foreign language or to go to something similar to the National War College.
Right. Let me just answer that, and then I'd invite colleagues to join me. I think the most important thing, Jim, right now, and I said in my opening that the State Department is under-resourced, and one of the places where it's most critically under-resourced is in this question of having enough people to go to professional education. When I first met Colin Powell, I said to him, every unit you ever commanded had a 15% float for training in transit. And we have nothing like that at the State Department. And he said, well, that's unbelievable. How many people do you need? And we said, well, I need 1,100 more people. And he said, we'll take care of it in 3 years. And so he was prepared to make that commitment. Now, most of those people ended up in kind of Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's still some work to do to come back to that. But that's the most important thing. You need enough people so that people can go into training in transit. And then secondly, don't forget, the Foreign Service is majority deployed, right? Most Foreign Service people are outside of the United States. They're working. And so there's not this unit rotation as there sometimes is in the military. So we can't take advantage of some of the natural breaks that military people have for training. But I'd ask Nick, perhaps, because you have a lot of military officers there at Harvard, and Nancy and Marcy as well.
Well, Marcus really did a great job answering it. We don't have enough money, and we don't have enough people. And that's why we don't have the training that the military does. I see it at Harvard, where I've been teaching for the last decade. We have a great number of military officers who come to us at the Army, Air Force, Marine, major level, Navy captain level. The military sends them for a year. They're with us for a 1-year master's degree. They're great people. They've all been deployed. We're lucky if we have one person from the State Department. In fact, this year we have one person, Zach Bailey, who's been helping us out on this project. And so you see the disparity. And obviously the military is a special status in the United States. It's so much bigger. It's 2.5 million people, active duty and reserve. We're about 11,000 American Foreign Service officers. So we may not need 20 spots at Harvard or UT Austin or University of Illinois, but we've got to give Foreign Service officers a chance to grow as they get to a mid-level and senior level.
Could I just ask Nancy, who was the head of the Foreign Service Institute, to comment as well?
I'd be delighted to comment and just offer a few remarks. And I'd mention two that will amplify what both of you have already said. We need much more professional development, much more professional education for two reasons. First of all, if we are going to recruit and retain the very best people that our country has to offer, and I'm thrilled to hear the passion of your questioner, Jim, and to know that you've got a number of students and people who are planning to enter the Foreign Service on this conference call. If we're going to get and keep those people, we have to give them an exciting, dynamic road ahead throughout the course of their career. And secondly, if we are going to have the kind of agile and modern and flexible diplomacy to respond to the challenges that are coming up over the course of the next few years and the next decades, people have to continue to learn, to look at new fields, to master new skills. You don't do that if you stagnate, if you never grow and challenge yourself through professional training opportunities. So I think it's hugely important, and I think we will be calling for a number of new initiatives in this field, both education, but also other types of opportunities, serving in the private sector for a period of time, doing interagency assignments, all things that will push people to develop new skills and new perspectives.
You know, I wonder, you know, we've seen so many people entering Congress and they say that they were a CIA officer or they were a veteran. Do any of you know how many FSOs are serving in Congress now?
There are a number of former FSOs who are serving in Congress. And one comes to mind, Tom Malinowski, who is a representative from New Jersey. But I know that there are a number of former FSOs who have tried or currently are in politics now. I'll share with you, though, it tends not to be a large number, in the past at least, because we have so deeply ingrained in us a non-partisan ethos. And it is as part of our moral code of conduct that all of us learn from the very first day we raise our right hand and take the oath of office. We serve presidents of every party, whoever the American people elect. So not so many go into political office.
So I know, Mark, you want to keep the discussion away from politics, but I think these questions here are worth hearing all of your response about. Anonymous attendee, let us compare our diplomatic strategy to that of China. They show up to everything and en force. Can you comment on how this aggressive diplomacy is to China's advantage, and how should the US be responding because we're not showing up? And there's a number of questions along those same lines. So I apologize to those of you who have written such questions, but I think with that, that'll give our guests something to work with, right?
Yeah. Marcy, would you like to start there, and then we'll follow you?
Sure. Well, I think actually that it's questionable whether this sudden, very aggressive diplomatic strategy of the Chinese is actually working to their advantage. It seemed so a bit at first, but now I think we're seeing that some people are actually resenting it and finding that it's too aggressive, and that it really is very much China acting in its own interest and cloaking it wrapping it up as if it's a gift to the country that's receiving it. But more broadly about multilateral diplomacy. Multilateral diplomacy is a special field with its own characteristics and skill sets. And that's an area that requires a great deal of expertise. Other countries post their officers for a very long time, sometimes in Vienna or Geneva or New York, where multilateral diplomacy is practiced. And something for us to think about is whether it would be better to have our officers also have longer assignments, because in those situations in particular, the diplomats who have been there for, let's say, 5 years or so, there's a dynamic that begins to happen between and among them, and knowing the issues and the ways of working there very deeply are an important part of being successful.
Jim, if I might just say, to follow on from what Marcy noted, I just wanted to respond directly to the question as well, which is that, and I recognize my bias, right? I spent my life being a Foreign Service officer, but I think this idea of showing up or engaging is enormously important. George Shultz, who during our time was, of course, a great Secretary of State, he used to call it tending the garden, right? You've got to go out each day and tend the garden. And maybe there's a more highfalutin sentence to say about that, but it conveys, right? You're supposed to go out every day and make these contacts, engage, listen to people, try to talk to them about what the United States is thinking. And when I think about the world as it is today, among the great advantages that the United States has is that we've got allies. And we've got allies that want to be with us and want to work with us, and we want to work with them. But to keep allies, you've got to, as George Shultz said, you've got to tend the garden, and you've got to consult them, and you've got to pay attention, and you have to listen, and you have to be patient. And all those things are important attributes of diplomacy. So I think this phrase, you got to show up, is extremely important. And the more we show up, the more we're able to play to the strengths of the United States of America. I don't know if Nick or Nancy might want also to comment on that.
Well, they just, Dallas-Fort Worth just put a wonderful photograph up of Secretary Shultz in his heyday. People will be glad to know he's 99 years of age. He's in good health. He's living out in Palo Alto, California at Stanford. He's a great man. I agree with everything Mark said. Just 2 quick points, Jim, on the questions you asked. China takes diplomacy very seriously. For about the last 75 years, the United States always had the greatest number of embassies and consulates in the world until this past year, when China, by design, passed us. And the Chinese, in my experience, very skillful diplomats. Their English is impeccable. They are very deep substantively, good negotiators. They are a considerable force for us to contend with diplomatically. And, you know, most of the big problems of the future are not going to be resolved by fighting. They're going to be resolved at negotiation tables. How to promote a vaccine, how to take on climate change, and we're going to have to contend with the Chinese. And my second and final point would be, you do have to show up. And so earlier this week, there was a meeting of 40 nations in the world to combine forces to raise money for a vaccine for the coronavirus, and the United States did not show up. We're the only country in the world not at the table in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We pulled out of the Iran deal. We pulled out of multiple UN agencies. We've withdrawn funding for the World Health Organization. We're not showing up. It's hurting American leadership and credibility.
So there's a question here, and I can't find it, but I saw it a minute ago, and I would have to scroll, but I remember it. And it was really about the politicization of the State Department, where the State Department, in a sense, the officers really don't have a seat at the table. And that's one of the issues that you're seeing now. How do you counteract that? Or is it just the way our government is structured, and you have to have a stronger relationship between the president and the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State has to have the support of the Foreign Service officers, which in many cases has not been what has occurred?
Well, let me start, and then I'll go to Nancy. I think it's worthwhile to go back to the photograph you just showed about George Shultz and Ronald Reagan, right? Because what you said, Jim, is 100% correct, which is it's enormously important that the Secretary of State and the President of the United States be working together, understand each other, that the State Department is seen certainly as supporting the President. And I know George Shultz spent an enormous amount, excuse me, of time and effort making sure that his relationship with President Reagan was as strong as possible. In terms of the question of politicization, there's another great picture of a way forward. So in terms of politicization, so we've been debating this among ourselves. So the question is, and we don't have a view on this, but there are a number of ways to think about this. So you could say, well, let's set a numerical limit, right? That 10% of ambassadors abroad should be political appointees. And I'll just speak for myself here. I think that America ought to have a place for non-career officers to serve abroad. People with great, excuse me, commercial experience, economic experience, management experience, foreign policy experience, because they teach something to the State Department. And I think we always ought to be open to new ideas. The numbers today, though, in my view, are way, way, way out of whack. Too many political appointees. So the question is, do you try to set a limit? Do you try to say to people, well, we'll try this through through various qualifications, and we've not come to a view of that yet. But we will, because this is an important thing and key to our report. The other thing I would say is that, as I said in my opening remarks, there's some self-examination that has to go on here. And so I think that one of the ways that foreign service people and professionals at the State Department, they're going to have to earn their way back to some of these tables. And right now, I think people say, oh, well, it's too hard, or too many political appointees. Well, that might be true. But who gets to go to the table is the person with the best idea. Who gets to go to the table is the person who can follow up. Who gets to the person who goes to the table is the person who can execute. And I think foreign service people have not pursued some of those skills. And so, yes, there may be ways to manage this, but one of the things that's required is that people are going to have to, foreign service is going to have to earn its way back to that policy table. Nancy, I don't know if you disagree with that.
Just very briefly, Mark, I agree, and I'd amplify 2 points. It's not a question solely of how many political appointees, it's also their credibility. I've worked with some phenomenally successful political appointees overseas and in Washington, but when individuals are brought in that don't have the skill sets they need in order to succeed in the job, they're undermining the institution as well as the administration that appoints them. Secondly, for the young people who are on this call and who are thinking about their careers, if the State Department becomes an institution where people can only progress to the mid or perhaps the very first rung of the senior levels before they run out of jobs, it's not going to be an attractive career path for them. For us to have the best and the brightest, to cultivate them into leadership positions, they have to be able to aspire to take on some of these very top positions so that they can then give back to the institution through governance and through their own leadership.
Let me jump in and read a comment and then go to Ambassador Burns, if I may. Nadia Douglas, as a hopeful FSO currently pursuing an undergraduate degree at Harvard and a mixed woman, Mexican and African American, I so appreciate the discussion of diversity and growth in the State Department. Nick, you know, Ryan Crocker often talks about expeditionary diplomats, and there was that wonderful book that came out just a few months ago about 4 foreign service ambassadors. And Juliana Allen from Dallas asked about the safety of foreign service officers. She says, obviously it's a huge priority and a legitimate concern, but when you have this type of limited interaction, especially in hotspots, how do you address this paradox? And I suspect, Marcy, you'll probably have some comments on this too, given the work that you did when you were in Baghdad as Minister Counselor for Political and Military Affairs. So let's try to hear from Marcy first, and then Nick, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I think that there have been in recent years quite a number of places where we've had to go where there was a significant risk factor. And we're all aware of that. We prepare ourselves for these situations. We have an incredible establishment, the diplomatic security folks who take care of us. But at the same time, we really have to get out and meet people. The point that Mark was making earlier about how diplomacy is really about talking and listening and relating with people. And if we can't do that, we simply can't do our jobs. So I think that we simply have to learn how to deal with risk, learn how to protect ourselves to a reasonable degree. And after that, we have to do our jobs. And that was something that I know you've had Ryan Crocker here a couple of times. He was my boss in Baghdad, and he got across the point that we really have to do our job here. It's critical for America, and we all felt that, and we all felt that we were adults and we had to figure out the best way to do things. So I think that's just a fact of life today.
Ambassador Burns or anybody else, would you comment on this?
Well, Jim, I just say I agree with Marcy. All of us, the four of us, have been ambassadors in the field. When you're an ambassador, you're responsible for the security of everybody in the mission. We have lots of different people from throughout the US government under our authority. And you've got that's job one, protecting people. But as Marcy says, you need to manage risk. We're not out there to live behind a fortress walls. We need to get out and meet people, engage with them, do the kind of commercial work that Nancy and Mark talked about earlier, do the kind of work in public diplomacy to let people see an American and get to know the values of freedom of speech, a big part of our culture. And so I think most of us in the Foreign Service are ready to accept the risk, intelligent risk. You don't do foolish things, but you want to go out and be on the front lines. And right now the culture, I think, is too risk averse. And sometimes that's imposed by Washington. And this is not just nothing about the Trump administration. This is all the administrations we've served in. Sometimes Washington bigfoots the embassies and tells them what they can and cannot do. I would leave most of those decisions up to the American ambassadors in the field. And quickly, Jim, it's so great you're getting so many questions from people who want to join the Foreign Service. So if you're a student there on this call, I hope you'll look at the State Department website, try to seek an internship with the State Department. That's how a lot of us got started as college and graduate students, as interns, and give it a chance. Take the exam. You'll do well. If you don't do well in the exam, just take it again. I failed the first time. When I was a senior in college, I thought my life was over.
They're all members of World Affairs Council, so they'll do well.
Exactly right.
Right.
One of the questions we have from two people, Brian is one, economic diplomacy seems increasingly important as an element of great power competition. Is there an effective way for the State Department to enable more fluid career options to allow officers to rotate back and forth between the private sector to take advantage of knowledge of those skills? Another listener or viewer also said, would it be better for people to work in the private sector for a few years before considering a career in the Foreign Service, or would you recommend a different career path?
Nancy, you want to take that first and I'll follow you?
Sure, I'm happy to. The two different questions that these individuals posed. The first one is, should people be able to spend time in the private sector? And the answer is absolutely yes. There currently is a program that allows economic officers to take 6 months of economic training and then to do a 6-month practicum with a corporation somewhere. But it's small scale, not enough people do it each year. I think it should be expanded, and I think the economic function should be performed by more than just those who carry the economic cone or specialization. But the second question is, should people dabble in other things? Should they work in the private sector for a while or a different field before joining the Foreign Service? And I think if you're interested in a field, absolutely you should explore it. The average age that people enter the Foreign Service now is somewhere between 27 and 30. So most people have either gotten an advanced degree, a master's degree, or they've worked for a couple of years. But I just want to reiterate what Ambassador Burns said. We want and need great young people to apply for the Foreign Service, to come in and to help us innovate, make this a better place to work and a more effective instrument of American foreign policy and national security.
Jim, if I could just add a couple of sentences. One is, I think that the questioner rightly says, well, shouldn't people be able to go to the private sector, come back? Yes, I agree with Nancy 100%. But also people in the State Department ought to be serving at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, or to go back to the previous question, in the Foreign Commercial Service, or other places where they can learn and then pursue economic diplomacy. We don't do near enough to put Foreign Service officers up on the Hill, in the House, in the Senate. So would I send economic officers to work in congressional offices where the member, she or he, might have a special interest in Economic diplomacy, absolutely. And one of the questions that we will have to face as we write this report is what to do about this question of lateral entry, how to let people come and go into the Foreign Service. Maybe people want to leave for a while, maybe they want to come back. Maybe we're looking for very specialized skills to bring people in. And this is very controversial, as you can imagine. But it's one of those cases where I think there's going to need to be some serious self-examination again about whether the opposition to lateral entry for all these years, is going to stand the test of time as the United States faces new and more complex challenges.
We have two comments or questions concerning COVID-19 in a sense. One is from Mary in Boston, World Affairs Council there, one of our great organizations. And she says, how are FSOs handling COVID-19? Are you seeing a lot of people being medically evacuated? And then, how will that affect their work? And then Kirsten from Dallas, she was in Morocco, and there were so many stories that we all read in the press. Some embassies seemed to handle it very well and were able to assist American tourists and citizens. Others were not. Morocco embassy, she said she was unable to even reach anybody on the phone. What is the role of the Department of State now in this globalized world for American citizens who may be trapped in other countries due to events clearly outside of their control?
Yeah. Nick, would you like to start with that?
I'd be happy to, and a shout out to World Boston. It's my hometown World Affairs Council. And that might even be our director, Mary, who asked that question. So the State Department has really stepped up for American citizens. I think at last count I heard this morning from someone in the State Department, they've evacuated 80,000 Americans back home to the United States. And you'll remember what happened in the first part of March. Borders just start slamming shut all over the world. A lot of American tourists, American students were caught, and they weren't allowed to leave the place where they were. And the State Department arranged special flights. Our embassies worked overtime, and evacuating 80,000 people in 6 weeks, that is a significant achievement. And if you think about it, Jim, the primary elementary work of the State Department of having an embassy overseas is to take care of your citizens when they get into trouble. And the four of us have done that work when we were junior officers. And so I think we can be very proud of what Secretary Pompeo and the State Department have done over the last 6 weeks in taking care of Americans.
If I might just add, I think that, again, to go back to the wonderful questions we've gotten from the students and those interested in the services, as Nick said, a primary reason to have an embassy abroad is to protect American citizens. And one of the good things, I believe, is that among the very first things that officers get to do is they work in that consular section. And yes, they're giving visas to foreigners, but much important as well is American citizen services, so that people can get their passports and get their work done, or in these emergencies, be evacuated. I don't know about the Morocco question particularly. Again, I spent my life at the State Department, so I'm sorry that somebody had a bad experience. But I think overall, the department's done quite a good job of bringing a very large number of people home. I think also, to answer the first question, our people overseas have lived with these lockdowns in countries all around the world. So far, I think there's been little COVID-19 infection of Foreign Service people and their families. Many families have come home, and you can understand that. But I was speaking the other day to someone at the U.S. mission, the U.S. Embassy in Spain. They were locked down like every other Spaniard for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time.
Well, Mark, we have about 3 or 4 more minutes, so I'm going to ask for a little rapid fire because we still have some really good questions. One is from the World Denver Board. First, thanks to all of you for your service to the nation. Let me read this question. The pandemic has highlighted the interdependence of all nations. Can this moment be used as an opportunity to rethink not only how to professionalize our own foreign service, but how the international community is organized? What do we need to be able to do to work more effectively with other nations? Tough
Marcy?
question to answer when we have just a few minutes,
I
but
was going to say that's not a rapid fire question. We'll see if we can get your rapid fire answer. Marcy?
Wow.
yeah, Marcy worked at the UN. She can do it.
Right.
Yeah, that is a profound question. I have to say that I agree with the questioner, that this is a point in time when it is important to reflect and think about what were the good things that we did, what were the things that were not so good, what kinds of structures could we have that would make it better. And I think we'll be thinking about this for a long time after this. What can we do that would make this kind of a threat, this kind of a terrible, actually an international disaster? What can we do to help each other better?
Could I also say that a little bit like the self-examination that the Foreign Service has to do, I think one of the answers to the questioner is the public has to demand this. And if you think that's important, then I hope people will be in touch with their elected representatives and speak out for these things, as I know people in World Affairs Councils do. And so if people think it's important, well, support the diplomacy that we have, and I hope the diplomacy that we'll help to create for the future.
Another few questions that we have goes back to the relationship between the Defense Department and the Foreign Service. And one person recognized that the relationship was strongest when you had Hillary Clinton and Bob Gates. How do you change the cultures in those organizations that they will work more seamlessly, or is it not possible?
Nick, you want to start with that?
I think, Jim, the relationship between the Pentagon and the State Department has been strong really the last 20 years. There was a time in the 1980s when there were real ideological fights between Secretary Shultz and Secretary Weinberger. As a loyal State Department person, I took the side of Secretary Shultz. But since then, the two institutions have really, every Secretary of State and Defense have worked pretty well with each other. Condi Rice with Bob Gates before Hillary Clinton and Bob Gates, for instance. And I served at the US mission to NATO. I was ambassador there on 9/11. We had more military officers and Pentagon civilians in our mission than we did State Department people, but we were one team. That mission has always been like that. And there have been times when the State Department's been so starved of funds that the Pentagon has offered to Congress to take some of its money and give it to state. Why do they do that? Because I think the military understands that we're both out there defending America. We're so much smaller state. We need each other. We live and work with each other. And I think some of our strongest supporters about the role of diplomacy are our generals and admirals and other enlisted people in the military.
Well, I think that's a good way to close tonight's discussion. Mark, if people want to continue to provide thoughts, should we route them to you or through each World Affairs Council, or what's the best way to do that?
Well, I think it would be great if you go on the website of Harvard University to the American Diplomacy Project, you'll find a way to comment. Marcy is the kind of holder of that case, but just as we said in the beginning, we hope people will comment. We want comments, and we would look forward to them.
Well, I want to thank Mark for giving us this opportunity. Nancy, so nice to meet you. Look forward to seeing you in person. Marcy as well. Nick, it's always a pleasure. Thank you all for the work that you're doing on this project, and we look forward to seeing the final report. I want to thank everyone for attending C by C Amplified. Always go to the World Affairs Councils of America website to find out not just what we're doing here in Dallas-Fort Worth, but all around the country at our over 90 World Affairs Councils. Have a great evening, and please stay safe. Thank you.